Welcome, Exiles. Let's talk elemental damage over time and why I think these changes should not happen or they should be modified. Chris Wilson mentioned on those podcasts when he was trying to basically put out the fire of 3.15 that he said, in the future, we're going to give you the information 3 weeks ahead of schedule instead of 1 week ahead of schedule. That way we can get feedback from the community. And if we're making bad changes, the community will tell us, hey, you're making a bad change, modify this. And that's kind of what I feel like I'm doing here, because the elemental damage over time changes. I can't speak for Ignite specifically, but for cold dot skills and for fire dot skills, they are a bad change. Now, why do I think they're a bad change? First of all, started off with elemental overload no longer affects LE dot skills. It's not going to work with cold snap. It's not going to work with righteous fire. And then on top of that, elemental equilibrium also basically is now useless. The two main keystones that were pinnacle required, very necessary to do damage with those skills are taken away. Now they say, hey, we're going to take these keystones away so they're not mandatory. I'm okay with that. The problem I have with this is they're taking away more damage than they're giving us back. They are giving us a lot of damage on the base, like the numbers, they're giving us some damage, but they are strictly worse in my opinion. I'm going to go over the math. Now, I'm specifically going to use the use case of righteous fire because that's what I know. That's what I know inside and out, and I can speak for that. But the example I'm giving you here is going to be pretty much the same across the board for other dot skills as well. So to begin with, the old way we did damage, looking at this is Shaper res. He starts out at 50 res. You take off 25 for Scorching Ray exposure. In other words, EE does nothing for us because you can get 25 exposure from Scorching Ray. You can get good exposure from a lot of different skills. You don't need EE to get that exposure, so it's irrelevant. And then the old EE gave us another minus 50 res, which is a huge multiplier, was mandatory for the damage. And then we would have something like one curse. Granted, when you get to higher investment, you might get a minus 9 res helmet, you might get an additional curse, stuff like that you could end up getting, which will make this less bad, but that's at the very high end of that investment. So after the fact, Shaper's resistance, after we've subtracted all this res from him, he has about negative 40 resistances, which is about a 1.4 multiplier. If you hit an enemy with 100 damage and they have minus 40 res, they're going to take 140 damage. So the multiplier would go as such. We have 100 damage, we get 1.4 multiplier from elemental overload, and then we get another 1.4 multiplier from minus 40 resistances. This takes us to close to 200 damage. Now, with the new change, we don't have minus 50 from EE, we just have minus 25, we just have flammability. Shaper ends up having about positive 10 res. So this ends up being a multiplier that makes us deal less damage because he has 10 res, so he resists 10% of the damage pretty much. And then on top of that, we have a base multiplier of how much the skills are being increased by. For Righteous Fire specifically, it was like 58% more damage on the base number of the spell itself, and about 75% more for the damage you got based on your life pool. I think roughly it's gonna end up being about 65% more damage change, unless you're solely based on gem levels and you're not scaling your life, then it'll be worse. But I'm being generous here and I'm saying it's about 65% more damage than it was previously. So what we have is 100 times 1.65, and then we multiply it by the Shaper has 10 res. And look at that. We have 147 damage. So previously we had 196, now we deal 147. This is strictly about 25% less damage, or another way of saying it would be previously we dealt 32% damage more. Right out the gate, if you're an early to mid-investment character, you have been strictly nerfed. I think this is a bad change. Why do I think this is a bad change? Because elemental damage over time skills, they're not strong. They're not overpowered. They didn't deserve a nerf. They shouldn't have came out from left field and shot in the head. It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I'll just give you some examples. Righteous Fire, 0.3% of use. Let's look at something like Cold Snap, 0.1% of use. Let's look at something like Wintertide brand. Oh, zero people using Wintertide. Let's look at Scorching Ray. Oh, 0.1%. You have an entire archetype, and it encompasses less than 1% of the player base, and you're making that archetype strictly worse. Meanwhile, you have something like, oh, I don't know, Forbidden Right. 6% of the player base, one skill, 6% of the player base. There's skills that maybe deserve a nerf. Forbidden Right would be one of those. And then there's skills that just don't. And it doesn't make sense to me why they're getting this nerf. I think what they should be doing is the skills should be coming out at the same level or slightly above. They should not be taking a massive 25% damage nerf. Now, The upside, of course, is you save some passes because you're not pathing to Elemental Overload, you're not pathing to Elemental Equilibrium. This could be anywhere from 3 passives all the way to something like 15, depending on your build. That'll start making up for this damage, this less damage multiplier. And then you also get better dot multi on your cluster jewels and a few gear slots. Speaking of those changes specifically, on investment, you can maybe start to get to the point where you aren't taking a damage nerf. You can kind of break even. I want to talk about dot multi. A lot of people are excited about the dot multi. Here's the thing. Dot multi is a diminishing return stat, the same as percent increased damage stat is. If it becomes an abundantly available stat, it has less and less value. And on top of that, it requires you to have high value to get to the or high gear investment to get to the point where you're breaking even from the damage nerf the elemental damage over time skills took, which is just kind of silly in my opinion, that basically the 1% of the 1% of elemental damage over time skill people, they'll end up a little bit ahead, whereas everybody else is taking a straight nerf. So that's kind of my issue on this. Other issues I see with this is, for example, elemental equilibrium. There are items that are based around it. The Malachi's Artifice, the Ziggy ring, that ring is basically never going to be used now. It's worthless. This keystone itself, I think, is pretty much worthless. It's not a keystone you're grabbing. It adds an awkwardness of it's going to remove the exposure type you want if you're a hit-based build, and it barely is a little bit better than any other type of exposure you could get from Hydrosphere, you could get from Frost Bomb, you could get from Scorching Ray, you could get from Wave of Conviction. Exposure, I think, I kind of hate exposure. It's a noob trap, basically. People don't realize you can only have one effective exposure, and it's only the highest that applies, and people get it on multiple places, and it just ends up making people's builds worse because it's just not very good. So this, I think, Elemental Equilibrium is now going to fall under the category of a keystone that's never picked up, never used, very few cases where it's being used. And Elemental Overload is basically only going to be used on Ignite builds, and that's it. Elemental hit-based builds that aren't crit are just bad builds. Crit is so much better than non-crit. You take any Elemental Overload hit-based build, you take out Elemental Overload, you invest a little bit into crit, and you improve the damage. It's just not a good change. The main builds that could use Elemental Overload that actually were a good reason to use Elemental Overload were the Elemental Damage Over Time skills, and you just took them completely out of being able to use it. So I think either you give Elemental Overload back to the Elemental Dot skills to make up for the damage nerf you gave them, or you have to propose numbers that are straight up 30% better than the numbers you have here, because otherwise these abilities are taking a straight nerf, and that just shouldn't be the case. One more thing I want to quickly address is the changes to the cluster jewels. Now, you guys might not remember, but you nerfed pretty much all the notables across the board significantly for dot skills last patch when you were nerfing every support gem. Elemental dot skills took a double nerf. They not only got the global support gem nerf, they got the cluster jewel nerf. The notables on cluster jewels are kind of bad now, and if you compare them to 6 to 8% multi, this is strictly going to make all cluster jewels for dot builds based around the small passives. It's going to become a scenario where everybody gets the 35% effect plus other good stats, and that's all people care about. It's no longer about some cool, interesting notable. It's just about bigger number, better build. I think if you're gonna change the small notables, you gotta adjust the big notables too. They have to be more interesting. They have to be better. Otherwise, it's just about the numbers. It's not about like interesting notables or cool passives you get through the cluster jewels. It's just about bigger number, better build. And I think that's also kind of for the worse. I think that makes the game worse. I don't think it makes it more interesting. Stuff like that gets to me. It's details like that that matter, in my opinion. So overall, guys, hopefully if GGG, anyone listens to this at GGG, you got to reconsider these changes. You got to consider giving elemental damage over time skills like 30% more damage, or don't take away elemental overload. One of the two things I think is something you have to consider, because as is, this is just straight up a nerf to skills that don't deserve a nerf in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't make sense. So that's my hot take on something I care about, something I know about. The reality is we're 1 to 2 days overdue on our baby that's being born. I'm not going to be here for next league. I'm not really going to get to play much, but I am concerned for the people who want to play elemental damage over time skills that have an archetype that just keeps taking hits. And I don't know why, because it's not an overpowered archetype. Stuff like that doesn't make sense to me. That's my thoughts on this subject. Hopefully, you guys appreciate them. Hopefully, it's something that maybe can make the patch better if you have somebody at GGG that sees this and says, okay, this change we're making maybe isn't a great change to make, and they modify it in some way. I don't know. That's the feedback I'm given. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Peace out.